Round of applause as our keynote speaker leads. We're going to move to our next session of the day. I'm a little biased about this session, I must confess. But we're speaking about the global digital revolution, Africa's place now and in the future. And please welcome with me the chair of the panel, Professor Alexander Evans, and the rest of... All right, so Professor Alexander Evans is the Professor of Public Policy at LSE, and he has a PhD in politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies and University of London. He's a career diplomat. He has worked as an advisor to the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, as a strategy director in the Cabinet Office, and he has served as Deputy and Acting High Commissioner to India and briefly Pakistan. He has led the United Nations Security Council Expert Group on Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and been a senior advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in the US Department of State. He was awarded an OBE for his work in Pakistan, where he led the UK's work on the tribal areas from 2007 to 2009. Please welcome with me, Professor Evans.
Great, thank you very much. And of course, the most important ingredient that I have to mention is that I went to primary school in northern Nigeria in the 1970s. So everybody needs to identify their Africa connection if they're going to be here. So I need to identify that. And actually, just picking up on the excellent speech we just heard, for me, one of the most powerful moments thinking about the connectivity across Africa was sitting at the Africa Union a few years ago for a meeting organized in partnership with the Commonwealth on cyber policy and security, and talking to a Nigerian delegate who was there with me. And we got to talking, and I said, well, I talked about being at school in Kaduna in northern Nigeria, and he said, which school were you at? And I told him. He said, do you remember the name of your head teacher? I said, yes, I do. And I shared her name. And he said, look at my name. And I realized I was speaking to the son of my head teacher when I was at primary school. So thinking again about that cross-African connectivity, the fact that you'd end up with a sort of Nigerian cybersecurity specialist sitting at the Africa Union headquarters with someone who had grown up being taught by his mother in northern Nigeria pointed to me about this connections that can be made across the piece. We're very lucky today to have an excellent panel who will be better placed than I am to tell you about the changing patterns of geopolitics, technology and opportunity in Africa. So let me welcome up, if I may, Aida Ndiaye, who's head of policy programs at Meta. And she is an international business leader with expertise in building and leading large-scale tech projects. Welcome, please come on and take a pew. And leads Meta's campaign strategy on integrity issues in Europe. She's previously pioneered Meta's public policy strategy across 22 countries in Francophone Africa, and she is also a public policy graduate, which is great, although apparently from some place called Oxford University, but we'll talk about that. But it's you know, other programs exist and they're very good, but it's very good to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Let's also welcome up Bosun Tijani, who's CEO of the Co-Creation Hub. So Bosun is the co-founder and CEO of the Co-Creation Hub, one of Africa's foremost social innovation centres, dedicated to accelerating the application of social capital and technology for economic prosperity. He's got over 16 years of experience across the public and private sectors, including with Pera Innovation Network, Hewlett-Packard and the International Trade Centre, and has a range of different academic qualifications and experiences, but including studying a master's in information system and management from Warwick Business School, and recently getting a doctorate in innovation systems from the University of Leicester. Very good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. And to cap our brilliant panel here, we also have Anna-Noemie Ouattara Boni, who's going to join us, who's excellent. Welcome. And Anna-Noemie is a finance and socioeconomic development professional with cross-functional experience across the non-profit, finance and multilateral institutions in Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. She's founded WinOrg, non-profit, an initiative empowering the un- and underserved communities through research-based SME development interventions in Côte d'Ivoire since 2017. Yeah. Which brings back to memory, I've only been to Côte d'Ivoire once, but had a lovely visit there when I was in the and she works in the digital inclusion space with the GSMA Mobile for Development Foundation, leveraging digital technology to drive socioeconomic impact, and is also a business school graduate, but much more importantly for me, a fellow SOAS graduate. So great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we'll move on. So thanks very much for joining us. I guess I'm going to ask a really open question, if I may, as the first question, which is just perhaps to all three of you, just what, if you were to kind of like pull back to 80,000 feet, maybe being on one of those Starlink satellites that's traipsing around the world right now, what would your key message be about where you think technology is taking the future of Africa in the coming 5 to 10 years? And perhaps I can come to you first.
Okay, thanks for putting me on the spot. But I think it's a great question. It's also very relevant to African growth and development. I feel that looking back at the COVID situation, it has really stressed a lot of conversation around how we can interconnect digital with health, with education, work and employment. So one of the good things of digital technology today is that in 10 years or 20 years, if we are really tackling the underlying challenges, we can progress with socioeconomic development. We can have more women being digitally included, and that means that the spillovers will also have an impact on the human development for the kids, for the community. So I feel that the digital technology, if we leverage it well, we go beyond the space of digital inclusion, will create jobs, will ensure that people that traditionally excluded, that can't afford to go to the hospital to get better treatment, could actually have that at the comfort of their home, whether they are in urban or rural areas. So these are the things when we look at the digital space. And I saw that in the panel briefing, there was a mention of the African Union 2063 goals, and I think they have 7 aspirations. And having looked at them, technology, digital driving technology can actually support with meeting most of these aspirations. So this is to tell that the topic today is not to be underestimated or not to be overlooked, because it has a great importance and it has a key place into African growth and inclusive development.
Wonderful, thank you.
No, absolutely. I think picking up from where you start, it's a conversation that is extremely important, and it's not just important for Africa, I think it's important for the world. You've asked for 10-year projection, which is a perfect time frame, because if you look at 10 years ago where we were on the continent, I think about 13 years ago, I co-founded the second tech hub in Africa. The first one was in Nairobi, governor, which I now manage as well. So you're my governor, my And if you fast forward to today and you see the impact of digital technology on Africa, you probably can also project what the next 10 years will be. About 13 years ago, the focus was on using technology to drive transparency, to force government to be a lot more open. And to the governor's talk earlier, you can already see the gains that we've made, right, within that space of time. I remember about 8 years ago when we were electing the last president in Nigeria. The biggest challenge was the fact that the electoral committee wouldn't let people know where to vote. Where do you pick your voters registration? All this information for the entire country was put on a PDF file. So if you want to know your polling unit, you have to go to a PDF file to find where to vote. But the technology crowd actually took the file, created a database for it, and made it easy for people to vote. And that was one of the key innovation that happened during that innovation. But today, people are using social media to mobilize. You're beginning to see that the electorates are having a better understanding of what they want from their leaders. And a lot of this is thanks to technology. But beyond that as well, you can also see the impact in commerce, in economics. Nairobi is always, or Kenya is always a reference point for for this in terms of what M-Pesa has done to financial services. But not just M-Pesa, for those who frequent Nairobi or Kenya a lot, it's probably more digitized than most cities in the UK.
Yeah.
You know, once you leave London, I don't know any other city, probably Manchester, that is as vibrant as Nairobi will be when it comes to application of technology. And you're beginning to see a lot of that in places like Lagos, you know, as well. You go to Kigali, you're beginning to see so many of that. So what would that be in 10 years' time? I think what 10 years will be is technology is going to amplify all the resources and the beauty of Africa that has been hidden away. It's a continent with a lot of untapped resources. Much has been tapped, but there's also a lot that has not been tapped, right? And what we have in digital technologies is that they amplify the beauty of resources. If you apply them effectively, you can make much more sense out of resources. And that's what you're beginning to see. The fact that you're also seeing the biggest workforce for technology in the world now emerging out of Africa, which means we will have the talent that we need to actually power the innovation that we need to see. So I think Africa is going to become an interesting case for the world. That's what I would say. An interesting case in how we can use these new digital technologies to actually bring the world to a more inclusive set, where we can do better with our resources, where we can produce new products and services as well that will not only be used on the continent, but also all over the world as well. And the biggest challenge will be leadership, right? Do we have the kind of leadership with a good understanding of how to position for this? You know, this is what led me to doing my PhD in innovation systems, because there's a clear understanding that you can't make the most of all these resources if you don't know how to organize around innovation. And there's a lot of leadership that is required, whether it's from the public sector or the private sector, people with an understanding of how you work with the global economic system to actually create value out of your resources. And I think that's the biggest challenge for us.
Wonderful, thanks very much. So what's your take, as it were, 10 years hence?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to add more, but maybe what I will do is just take also just step back and just have to know that when it comes to digital technology and the growth of digital technology across the continent, we're not all in the same place, right? Nairobi is in a very much different place. South Africa is in a very much different place than, let's say, Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, Rwanda as well. When we talk about e-governance and how the work that the digital economy there has done in terms of making sure that public services are digitalized is really forward thinking, and I think amongst the best across the world. But at the same time, we have countries like the Republic Democratic of Congo, right, where still only 5% of the population is connected. So I think it's always hard to give an Africa view, right, because everyone is at a different stage. So I think it's important to recognize that. But I agree with the very positive and optimistic outlook around the future of technology in the past 10 years. And just picking up on what Bosun was saying and coming from a social media background, so to speak, I've been in the sector for the past 10 years or so, and this, it was very much Facebook was the internet, right? Like everyone where I went, like when we used to say I work for Facebook, we're treated like superstars. So that was right after Cambridge Analytica, then we weren't anymore. But really, people love the idea that that social media in a way was simple, easy enough that depending on your level of literacy, you could have access to it. Like my cousins back in Senegal in the village could speak on WhatsApp to me via audio, right? And they don't know how to read or write in French. And that was the beauty of social media, so to speak. And I think we've seen a progression beyond that, right? We've seen a progression beyond, first in terms of like workforce, right? We're seeing much more engineers, right? Investment in STEM, right? There's a master's in AI from Rwanda, right? And there's a development there, I think, that is going to continue to grow. I think as well the startup scene in Africa has to be talked about, and it's quite promising. Just this year, I think the statistics was around 3.3 billion was invested in around 600 startups in sub-Saharan Africa. That was up like 55%, like from what was last year. So imagine, I think for a lot of we as Africans see the beauty of our continent, but I think more and more foreign investment is also seeing and the beauty of the continent, which is really important, right? Because the development of the continent and the development of technology in the continent won't happen by Africans alone, right? It has to be a global movement, so to speak. So I think that is an exciting trend that probably, hopefully, will grow. And I think Africa, in many ways, is leading the charge when it comes to fintech and mobile banking, and the fact that for many people, they thought that when you think about the development of the African continent, it's going to be a very linear process, similar to what Europe has done, right? The industrial revolution, then we'll go to the digital revolution. But we're seeing this idea of leapfrog, not in all areas, but fintech is a good one, right? Then I would say in the next 10 years, probably the biggest challenge will be around regulation, and I say that because I'm a policy person, so we like to put regulation into everything. But I think that's going to be really important because the African continent is still a very much fragmented continent, right? The Digital Trade Act is coming, but every single countries have their different policies. And to His Excellency's speech, right? When you go across the European Union, you don't need to show an ID card, right? You can just travel from Germany to France via train, in and out, very easy. It feels truly like a common area, right? Of free transfer of people and goods. That's not the case, right? I am from West Africa and we have ECOWAS, and I still have to show my ID card to go to Cote d'Ivoire, right? And I still sometimes have to pay tax, although the law says that we shouldn't be paying tax for it. So those challenges at the more, I would say, like personal, physical uh, process also exists for the businesses and the tech companies who want to evolve in the African continent, and being able to unlock that would be key for that prosperous future that you both described.
Wonderful. Thanks all very much. So, what I think we've heard is a pretty positive, actually, framework for the potential for technology. That sense of there's a non-linear pathway here for the application of technology in Africa. Huge challenges, but also opportunities around human capital and leadership. But also just the sheer potential that technology can play in terms of transforming development and economic growth. Okay, I'm a recovering bureaucrat. Obviously, I became a bureaucrat because I was attracted by the glamour and the money of being a diplomat, and I spent most of my career as a diplomat. And look, I'm certainly struck. It resonates for me hearing about the potential for digital services. But actually, in many countries I've been to around the world, actually digital services have been much better than has been true, say, in the US or the UK. Because in a sense there's a non-dependent pathway to be able to invest. I just wondered if we could touch on government for a moment, because particularly around government services, right? I'm from the government and I'm here to help you is not the phrase that people always think they're going to hear. I'm from the government, I'm going to tax you is often the phrase that people do hear. So I just wondered about e-government services. I just wondered from each of you, or only if you want to raise it, but is there one particular area of government services where you think there's the most exciting potential for technology to be applied in Africa, or where it's already being applied, and we should be paying attention to it?
I'm gonna get on your payroll very soon, Governor. No, I think Nairobi is doing fantastically well in this area. So there's something called the Ujuma Center, which I actually think the academic world is not done enough research on. Because I think the biggest challenge, to all the points you've raised, I stopped talking about these things not because I don't think they exist, but I think the biggest challenge with Africa is even the structure within government and public sector. We've inherited these systems mostly from the British system, and generally that government all over the world is not the most progressive when it comes to innovation. And for a lot of the things and the challenges that we face on the continent, there's massive opportunity for the innovation crowd, for entrepreneurs who are more for good to start thinking, how do we innovate around creating this solution? And until we start to innovate, even the policies will never change to catch up with some of the thinking. So to your question, for instance, I think Kenya is doing fantastically well, looking for ways to apply technology in government. And one of the biggest challenge when you do that in societies will be adoption, because we always, the technology crowd gets excited about opportunities for application, but then you still need to think of how do you get people onboarded. And I think one thing that was done in Kenya, which is quite good, is the Huduma Center, which is almost like a one-stop shop where any citizen could go to understand how to digitally access government services. And I feel like it's a lesson that can actually be documented. And of course, there's still opportunity to improve upon it, but it can be documented and introduced in so many other places across the continent. Government in places like Nigeria has been doing quite a bit to try and digitize as well. I do business in Senegal. The government there is also trying. But the challenge is always you don't just take people from 0 to 10, right? How do you truly onboard them and warm them up to digital services? And I think the advantage you have in Kenya is the fact that financial services, which is crucial to everyone's daily life, is already quite digitized.
Yeah.
So automatically, people are somewhat indirectly enlightened about digital services. But even that wasn't enough, which I think was why the government came up with the Uduma Center, which is a fantastic idea that I think can work literally anywhere in the world, because even in the UK, there are still places where you go and citizens don't find it comfortable to do everything online. There's still option for physical ways of doing things. I think that's one innovation that I truly like.
So I'm liking this. We're kicking off right away talking about things that are already working, not just things, not just kind of like PR for stuff that could work in the future. So anything on your side that you think of?
Sure, I can talk for Cote d'Ivoire. So I know that in recent years they've implemented what we call cash transfers, which is very similar in other countries like Colombia and other countries in Africa as well. And the system in Cote d'Ivoire is the cash transfers are still being, some of them actually, are still being done like hand in hand. There is that opportunity to digitize the G2P government to people payments. I think this provides a huge opportunity area here in terms of traceability. Where is the fund going, and reduces those risks of, let's say, bribery / corruption, because this is again a very huge and sensitive topic in African economies. So this is again an area where we can leverage digital technology. I mentioned that some because I also understand and I also observe that it's the way it is working. You have like mobile money payments and services that are being leveraged to support the rural poor, but you also have that other side of society that are still being handed money every day. I mean, every month. The opportunity here is if we go further and we actually digitize the entire process, we are not just allowing people to have mobile money services, but in the long run, we can also consider digital training skills and literacy for the people. So as much as we are supporting the rural household every month, they're also benefiting from some kind of education in how to be onboarded on the digital space. So I think that's a very like good system to put in place. And yeah, I wanted to use the Ivorian example for that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, for me, I mean, there are couples. It's hard to choose, actually. I mean, I've mentioned one that Kenya's sister, and it looks like we definitely see the East African champions there. Where, if you're an African, probably one of the most common experience we all have had is wanting your birth certificate at the at the government, and it takes you months or weeks. And Rwanda is one country that has unlocked that through digital technology. The process is digitalized from end to end, and at the end, you just get an email from from the registry giving you your birth certificate or your passport, right? So, and that's key because that allows you to apply to jobs, right? To be able to evolve as an African. Another one that comes to mind, and there's something here to say about African cities and capital cities really being innovative, is Johannesburg, and the issue of procurement, right? And we know that corruption is an issue not only for the continent, across the world, right? Many countries face the issue of corruption, and government tenders are particularly a critical point there. So the city of Johannesburg is doing an exciting experiment there by digitalizing the whole tendering process and really making sure as well, using technology to build a more equitable and inclusive society, make sure that underrepresented businesses or marginalized businesses are still part of the tender process and have an opportunity to work on government contracts. So that's an interesting one. And maybe one last point I would say, that's a broad term, is that um, I think I read in your bio that you've done you've worked with the World Bank or like some of the big organizations. For all of us who've been in the development sector for quite a while, we know that there have been so many failed digital projects, right? That this idea that we're gonna get African government to be digitalized, right? You see that in every country's 2026, 2022, 2023 plan, right? And I've seen that for the past 10 years. And unfortunately, many of those projects haven't been successful. From my experience on the ground, one thing that's key as well, and when we talk about technology, is that it's important not to use technology as a panacea, but also understand what problem do we have and how can technology help us solve that problem. I I felt in Johannesburg why the digital procurement system was really helpful was because there was a there was a situation, and there is still a situation in South Africa where many people are fed up with corruption, right? And there was a need from the citizen to say we want more transparent systems, right? So both from the constitution and the citizen's perspective, you get this strong call that we want something better, and then a digital system respond to the needs, right? And in a way as well, you get civil servants to comply because there is a high pressure of accountability. So I think I just wanted to leave that last point there around thinking through. We would all love to have our government to be fully digitalized, right? But we know that won't happen, and thinking through how, when, and why, and the specific use cases is as important to make that future reality.
Well, thanks. And look, I mean, I think there's a universal challenge here for governments, right? That the level of investment required to digitize is huge. The level of investment required to tackle cybersecurity is huge. So sometimes there's that trade-off. Are you trying to basically better securitize your back office and services and platform and cloud data storage, for example, or are you trying to invest in the lead new initiative that is going to deliver user experience for citizens? But look, one thing that is really exciting, it's come through by all your remarks so far, is the sense there's a tremendous unleashing of skill in Africa, right? A young workforce, an incredibly capable workforce, digitally literate in a way that I'm still that generation where I'm a two-finger typist, and as family members say cruelly, he's more of a Facebook guy than an Insta guy, so you know where you sit. But I just wanted, we also know that we've got, Bosun, you mentioned leadership. We know that we've got some challenges here around how do we have digital literacy in terms of leadership. How do we make the most of this extraordinary human capital that's available? And I just wondered, if you were thinking about that mix of kind of like, it's almost for matching, right? How do we match for money to the people? And how do we make sure we've got leaders who are well advised and well informed about technology policy and investment, and indeed the regulatory policy issues that we're raising? What can we do around the human capital agenda on technology and digital services and digital growth in Africa?
So it's a very important question because we see that in sub-Saharan Africa we have the supply for labor is greater than the demand for labor. So the ILOs actually estimates that 85% of people are actually in the informal sector. So this again represents an untapped opportunity for both the private sector and the government to leverage the digital technology to ensure that they can boost digital skills and training for young people and women. I see that this is one of the aspirations for the African Union to ensure that they invest in women and young people, and this is one way of doing that. The reason why I'm using that space is because in one of the top areas across the digital economy, we see e-commerce, and this is very huge for women MSMEs across sub-Saharan Africa. So those women may have the phone, they may have started their businesses, but they are most likely to fail when compared with men. So how do we ensure that yes, they didn't go to school, they don't have like the formal education, but they have a mobile phone, they can go through training that will help them with the digital training, with the e-commerce, with how to communicate and gain customers. So this is one of the ways to do that. I see that Orange Foundation in Côte d'Ivoire, in Senegal as well, they do a lot of that. They have a lab with 3 key things: the one around coding for girls and for women and girls, one around creating an accelerator programs for entrepreneurs, and another one around training and educating on digital technologies. So this is again another example. I'll use Kenya here as well because this is very interesting. In Kenya, Safaricom, which is like one of the biggest, if not the biggest TMT company, they recently carried an audit to look at the product and services and how they can better support people that are disabled. When we talk about digital technology, sometimes we all talk about inclusion, but we sometimes forget that other accessibility part of things. Most of the time our digital solutions are not that much inclusive for people that have apparent inapparent disabilities. So they carried the audit and they found out that most of the products were not as inclusive for people that had visual impairments. So what they did here was to I think they got three solutions. One being having an IVR to ensure that if I'm visually impaired, I'm still able to check my balance. Another program which allow me to read my SMS with Braille, and another one with the voice biometrics. This is very important. This is a very specific to Kenya, which has worked well, but this is something that can be considered in other countries, but also assessing the issues there and see how we can not replicate the solution, but how we can also cater for that other side of the society as well. And I think this is very important.
Yeah, I think the issue of talent in Africa is a wicked problem, if I can describe it that way. Because you have the leaders being challenged to create inclusive approaches to ensure that we can create opportunities for people at different, part of the society. But our biggest problem is that, if we're not building enough companies or creating the job opportunities that we need to actually give to our people, regardless of where they are, I think there's a limit to what government can create. I think government's role should be creating that enabling environment for more people to be created. But it's also not that very straightforward because we live in a world today where the talent market is global, right? For those who come from Nigeria, there's every likelihood that every Nigerian in this room that is at LSE is not going to go back to Nigeria, right? After they have studied, which is a big problem because you have companies like Meta, you have Microsoft, all the biggest companies in the world now recruit from everywhere, in the world. In my company, we lost in the last probably 24 months about 30 people to Canada, to the UK, just those two countries, just a company of 120 people, right? So we're unable to retain our biggest talent on the continent. When conversations around immigration is being discussed, people tend to think it's all the African kids who want to come to Africa. But the way immigration is structured is that the best talent from Africa are constantly being sucked out of that continent. And when you keep doing that, if we don't have leadership who can make a strong case and give reasons for these folks to stay, we're not going to be able to plug the gap that exists in creating opportunity. Because when those people stay, is when they create the value, is when they manage the businesses that becomes more prosperous and can add value to the economy and can create jobs. When they stay is when they create the new tech companies that will not only employ people, but employ people and pay them global salaries, which so people can actually stay. And you can already see this in a few cities in Africa. You see more people being comfortable living in places like Kigali. More and more, I think people in Kenya are not living anymore because, again, if you're in Nairobi and you earn a certain amount of money, you can still live a decent lifestyle, compared to anywhere in the world. So you're seeing people in those cities staying, but it's not the story for the entire continent. And I think where leadership is required, but not only just leadership, and also for the folks out here. Like in my company, we have an agenda that we're trying to get to, which is the fact that CCOB is eventually going to set up in the UK, in the US. And the reason for it is to target these folks so that, when they're here, they don't just see the path to their future being an employee. You can be an African in London who has a fantastic business idea, but if you can find the resources and the platform to support you in London, you don't have to go back. Create that business, especially if it's a business that is going to create solutions to a key problem on the continent. Create a business, great as an international business, and hopefully you have offices across the continent and at some point add more jobs to what we need to see. I think it's the biggest challenge. How do we plug back all these fantastic talents that we have abroad back to the continent?
Obviously, I mean, the big tech companies have been real investors in that talent, haven't they? I mean, across Africa as a whole, there's an incredible diaspora of a different kind, right? Which is all the people who can sort of point to the firms that they've been with. I mean, what are your reflections on this question of sort of talent and human capital?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with Bosun. I think the talent, the brain drain is real as a problem in the African continent, but I think it's important maybe to look at it from from two different perspectives, right? So first, I think the idea of human capital and its role in Africa's digital revolution, it's undeniable. That is actually the one thing as Africa we need to focus on, right? Because when you think about, and because I had the chance to be in this conversation at the global level, a lot of the time as Africans, what we ask is, how do we get a seat at the table? Like, why, how we part of those big negotiation of these investments, right? And this development, because you need research and development to really grow tech. Uh, and the reality of it is that the countries who are already at the table are countries who are which are already very wealthy, right? And they have very mature market, right? And most of business when it comes to tech is happening in those countries. Our value add, given our demographic dividend, is really that human capital, right? So if imagine if when we think about tech as a global economy, we were able to say actually 30% of all human capital when it comes to tech are actually Africans, right? These are African engineers, African researchers, African scientists who are helping build the metaverse, who are helping build the future of AI. Just imagine the power of the African continent and the power we would have globally if we were able to make that statement. In that case, we wouldn't be asked to have a seat at the table because you don't ask for that. You just take it because obviously Africa needs to be consulted, right? So I think for me, we have to have that clear vision to begin with. And in that sense, I see the issue with brain drain, but also I'm not too concerned with it. And let me tell you why. Because in a company like Meta, if you have the value of having an engineer from Nigeria, from Senegal, from Cote d'Ivoire, or from Kenya is that even having people who are on the business side, is that those are the people who are thinking, what about this? We were building this technology um, for I don't know, the UK market. Let's take Facebook market because that's what comes to mind. What would it look like for people back home in Nigeria? What would it look like for people back home in Cote d'Ivoire? So I think that kind of thinking and that kind of perspective should not be underestimated, right? And what we see as well is that a lot of the career journey for a lot of those people is that they would spend 5, 10 years, have some business startup ideas, and try to invest back in the continent. And I think the role of leadership there is make it attractive for those people to come back because there's a lot of value to be in a company like Meta, Google, Microsoft because they've figured out something. They've just figured out how to build $1 billion company, right? So how do we make sure that we have our people there, but also make sure that people come back and invest that talent into the continent? So for me, I think that's really the role of leadership, and that's why fostering the Black diaspora and the African diaspora is really important. It's not because you've left that you've truly left, right? Let's make sure that we have a way of having you back in the continent.
Absolutely, and I mean, people sometimes forget that even with the UK, we've got about 5.5, 6 million British citizens who live outside the UK, around the world. 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 million in Asia. I'm sure significant numbers in Africa as well. And often that's unspoken about, and some of that talent is obviously in tech, and it shouldn't be necessarily one-way traffic. It can be sort of in multiple directions. Can I just sort of turn perhaps a little bit to one angle though, because obviously at least as AI is a perfect dinner party discussion in any city around the world, right? We all have views about. It's like during the financial crisis, we all have views about banks. Now we all have views about AI. We don't always know what we're talking about, myself included, but we all have views, right? But one thing it seems that's true around AI is that the scale of data, the scale of data analytics, the insight that can be got off that data is going to be really material to the potential monetization, acceleration of AI. Africa doesn't just bring this huge pool of talent, it also brings a huge pool of data, not least through the adoption of smartphone services, not just in cities, but also thinking about rural areas and development as well. Perhaps thinking also about the regulatory angle on this, what can be done perhaps at a more Africa-wide level, or indeed at a regional level, to make sure that Africa benefits from African data, rather than necessarily that data is being monetized and drawn on by others? Are there things that the African Union can do, or that regional organizations can do?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that one. It's a fascinating question, right? I think one of the theme of the panel is on geopolitics, and the question of data flows is at the heart of geopolitics, right? It's one of the issues, right? So we're seeing we don't talk about it as often, but there is definitely an EU, Europe, US battle around data flows, right? Who get to keep the data, and we're seeing it through the transatlantic data flow agreements and discussions that are ongoing. We obviously see the US, China, right, and that is being played out through TikTok. Right now, at the moment, a couple of days ago, the TikTok CEO was in front of the US Senate, when it's really the idea that who's gonna win, right? And unfortunately, we tend to think about it as a zero sum game, which I think is a mistake. But the idea of who's gonna win is gonna be who holds the data, right? And America, US has an advantage because a lot of the biggest tech companies are American, so the data centers are there. And we're seeing the global south and the African continent included missing in the conversation, right? India has been, for instance, very good at being able to have a stake there just because, again, India is a huge market. It has the advantage that the continent doesn't have is that India is one country, right? 1 billion, over 1 billion people, but one country. So they have that leveraging power. I can say to all the institution and entities, so to speak, leveraging data, hey, we want data centers in our country, right? And create that leverage point. In the African continent, we're seeing also African countries wanting to do the same, right? Wanting to say, hey, we need to localize the data, we need to build data centers. But then there's a couple of issues with that thinking. And for me, one is that data in itself is not valuable. It's what you do with the data, right? It's the ability to process the data. That's what create AI models, right? And that's what create things like ChatGPT that are like very popular right now. And really, that's what excites everyone about the future of AI and also what it means for the industrial economy and jobs, so to speak. And I think one of the biggest problem in the African continent, right, rightly so, is around storing the data and generating data. I think we're still at the stage of where we need to be generating data, and we need people to come online for that, right? We're thinking, we talked a lot about Nairobi, we talked a lot about these big African cities, but they're exception, right? I think we really need to remember that there are parts in the continent where people don't have 2G, right? And I think really when we think about building a vision of development that's inclusive, getting people online is really important to generate that data and that traffic, right? So once that I think for me that's the biggest thing. Like we should be building infrastructure, right? We should get people online, and more Africans should be online. And then second, I think we have to think about then the flows of data and really allowing the African private sector to be able to use that data. And so here, I think investment as well in both data storage facilities, investment in human capital is really key for us to be able to unlock it. And I do think we shouldn't also close ourselves to the world, right? I think there's a lot of value in, and I say that obviously sitting and representing an American company, but I think there's a lot of value in actually having those companies invest in the African continent, invest whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's data centers, because the investment will be mutually beneficial to the continent. So just to summarize for me, I think it's key. The data conversation, we need to go back to basic, get people online, connected, and more African online. Second, transfer of data within the African continent. And here we need regulation, but we also need the infrastructure for that, like the data centers for that, and also the countries to really foster that inter-Africa trade, which I know the Africa is trying to unlock. And third is really we should be looking at foreign direct investment and investment from other big players across the world to invest within the continent to generate that flow of data.
Thank you. And if I may, I just wanted to kind of add in this, because there is obviously this debate about fixed infrastructure versus mobile infrastructure.
Yeah.
And if one's thinking about rural communities and people who are less well served, it's great and well to talk about fibre if you're sitting in a mega city or a capital city or a commercial centre. It's much trickier if you're sitting in a rural space. But any reflections on your side on this data and connectivity challenge?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the investment opportunity areas targeting specifically rural communities can be the setup of mobile hotspots, for example, and that can be again applying SDG 17, like the partnership for the goals, like ensuring that the government in partnership with the private sector is able to cater for those needs. So I think this is one of the things that we can definitely look into. So I worked in the UNDP Sustainable Finance Hub, and we were looking at that from an African perspective, and the research were made, consultation were made, like on the private sector across few countries. I think it was Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana, and these were the outcomes, that the solution that was provided. To add up to Aida's point, I love what you just said around the data and around having more people connected. I feel that the thing that I can add from my perspective is to really understand and assess the state of technology, internet connectivity in Africa, and then we'll have a greater appreciation of the fact that Senegal is here, Cote d'Ivoire is there, Nigeria is there. That is very important. Once we have done that, we look at the impact on the women and men, both in urban and rural areas. There we can see that, okay, we have like a divided, or let's say the impacts are more felt in the rural communities. Once we have that good or strong assessment of the situation, we can look into how to translate them into national economic and social development priorities that can now be filtered down into investment opportunities area for FDI, the private sector, wherever they are, to redirect that capital where it is mostly needed. I think this is very important, and that can be, again, something to be considered. And the third thing, well, we have assessed the situation, we have now like the priorities, investment, how can we ensure that we are not sort of like preventing people or businesses that want to conduct business or invest in those areas. So this is, again, partnership for the goals, ensuring that the government, in partnership with the private sector, are able to, let's say, ease that enabling environment. So in terms of policy and regulatory, to ensure that we can easily, start those business, lead those initiatives. Yes, they will have a positive impact, that they will also have a greater financial return. As much as we are really, I'm always coming from a socio-economic point of view, but don't see that as a charity, because there's always, that greater financial return. So it is a win-win case. So I think that's also a way to go about it.
Thank you. And by the way, as an aside, I'm just struck by the fact that price transparency through data services can have a real transformative effect, right, for rural communities. Just that ability to kind of take agricultural products to market in a more effective way, reducing waste, improving revenue for people. Bosun, any thoughts on this question about?
I thought it's a very complex question. I don't think the answer is as straightforward either. I think it's extremely complex. You started off with a fantastic example. The US and China fighting over TikTok. What does that say? Right. Government is like, data is the future. It's the future of competitiveness of nations. And it's not going to be as straightforward as just saying, yeah, we don't have infrastructure, let's just connect more Africans. Because we've already seen that there's depth of knowledge on how data should be handled from places like Europe and the US, which is why these countries or group of countries would tend to look to be anti-innovation when it comes to data, because they are reacting to what they're seeing, right? Because they're protecting their society and protecting their citizens. And because government is not fast enough, the leadership that we're seeing around data is being driven by private innovators. I work in tech, right? I fund startups. It's what we want to see, but we also know most of the time that tech founders don't necessarily project enough into the dangers of what it creates, which is the problem with Facebook and elections. It's not because Facebook is evil. It's because these technologies have repercussions, right? And society must structure in such a way that while we encourage innovation, we also encourage the understanding of how you protect society from it. So I think the biggest missing part in conversation on data in Africa is actually academia, in my opinion, because I feel like the academia will bring in the balance that we need. We're extremely lucky that the bulk of the data in Africa is still dark data. It's not because we're not collecting data. We may not be connected, but data is being collected. But the data is dark, is not connected, right? And as we get the push, as technology becomes cheaper, as connectivity becomes a lot more accessible, we're going to get to the point where data on everything in Africa will be available. But the question is, are we building the capacity of the public sector system to be able to also protect society from how that data is managed? I don't think we're seeing that, and I think there's massive opportunity. Governor, if you don't have a strong data team, I think Nairobi should have a very strong team that is focused on data and what is being done with it. And not from the perspective of stopping innovation. It's actually from the perspective of saying, how do we enable it, but also encourage it such that it's bringing value to us as a society. Because data is king. The reason why China or the US is keen on TikTok is that China becomes more competitive, not just by war. China is just going to become more competitive if they can collect data on everybody in the world. That's why the US is pushing back. That's the future. If we're sitting here talking about jobs, where will jobs in 10 years come from when the source of competitiveness for economies is going to sit in the US or sit in China? Yeah. And Africa will have absolutely no clue about that value and the resources that we're generating. It's a big problem.
Yeah. No, just wanted to respond to that quickly, and I agree completely, but I do think, though, there might be an overregulation of data in Africa, right? If you think about privacy regulations, for instance, and a key example of that is Mauritius, right, where they basically applied the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation that directive was applied in Europe. It's a highly complex law, and it's a law that was basically created to, like, let's be honest, to stop Meta, Facebook, Google around their practices on data. Mm-hmm. But if you're a small startup starting up in like Mauritius and you have to comply to the GDPR, the burden of compliance, right, compared to the amount of data you have, or even the complexity of your organization, is just becomes there just becomes a dichotomy there, right? It becomes contradictory. And I agree, I think we need better policies and governments, but probably we need better policies that fit the reality and the context of the African continent. And the danger we're seeing when it comes to regulation in the African continent, there's a lot of copy-paste of laws that were developed in a very specific context, right? So the laws that the EU is developing right now is very specific to their market, right, and to the threat destined to their economy. And so we can't be replicating those same laws if we want innovation to happen. But I agree with you that it's
so that's an affirmation of what I was saying. You know, Europe is approaching it from a reactive point of view. We don't have to copy, which is what you're saying. So the solution is not, and the reason why we copy is that we don't have the capacity, right? Which is why I'm saying the academia may have a strong role to play. Mm-hmm. How do we build local capacity in Africa to be able to come up with our own laws? Because we want our small companies in Nairobi to thrive, in Lagos, in Cape Town. We want them to thrive. So we don't want to pull them down. But at the same time, I work in startup. One of the biggest problems in startups in Africa, for instance, is the most successful technology companies in Africa are not African companies.
Yeah, that's true, very true.
They're all domiciled in the US, which is a much more complex thing. But whatever happens, those are not African companies.
Well, look, just one aside. I think sometimes it's, we began on a very positive note. We're going to come back to that. We're going to pivot back to positivity, right? Not least because it's Sunday morning and a bundle of people have turned up in LSE and on a rainy day in London. But I would also just emphasise the fact that Africa brings a voting bank. Mm-hmm. Africa brings a voting bank. If you think about some of the areas of contestation around data standards, around standards in the ITU, for example, around technology, actually African votes matter. And that's as much about an Eswatini or a Djibouti as a Kenya or a Nigeria or a South Africa. So there is something, I'm recognizing that sometimes, if you have a delegation of 15 on one government side and you've got a delegation of one, and this is what I'm mostly doing on Tuesday, but it's not always an equal space, but there is an opportunity there. Now we've had what I think has been a great exchange up here, but I'd like to open it up if that's all right, if the panel are content to unleash the creativity of our audience and just invite questions. I see a hand up there, first of all. Yeah, sir.
Hi there. My name is Luther Hinga. I'm from Kenya, but raised in London. I've got a question for the panel. Very scintillating conversation. I myself am currently building a educational technology startup. And how could African countries best incentivize people who are starting up companies in Africa as opposed to being domiciled in the US or Dubai because of the tax-free sort of benefits?
Okay, should we take a couple of questions and then come back if that's all right? The lady up there, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Fatma Ahmed from UNDP, based in Addis Ababa. I've really enjoyed this panel, so thank you all. I do want to keep on the positivity, and I like the fact that we talk about the untapped potential, but I do have a question back on the regulation. Interestingly, no one yet touched upon cryptocurrency in the informal sector, and that's really thriving in a lot of parts of Africa. But you're seeing a lot of regulations rather than embracing it. There's some countries, Tanzania for instance, that are curious and want to see what it looks like for regulation. So coming back to that, how can we from your expertise, incentivize African countries to see the benefit of it? And how can we also get certain countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and others that are utilizing technology and are, being a great space for tech companies to be based there? How can we really see how we can really unlock some of this potential, both in terms of cryptocurrency, the informal sector, and incentivizing investors? Because a lot of investors that are coming from the US or Silicon Valley are a bit cautious when it comes to Africa. So how do we really invest in that so that the human capital and more investors can come back to the continent? Thank you.
Great. Let's take one more. Let's take the lady there. Sorry.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. Fantastic conversation going on. I'm afraid I'm going to bring in some of the negative that you talked about earlier, and it's to do. My name is Noni, by the way, Noni Ugboma. I'm a PhD student from UCL. So just writing on Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, and looking at the concerns around not just privacy, but the concerns about, I think you touched on it, Bosun, when you said that we do a lot of copying when it comes to regulation. But how do we guard against the use of data and the digital platforms to manipulate stability and to disrupt our culture and all the other good things that are happening on the continent as a result of this digital revolution? Because it's a youthful continent, but they're easily manipulated. So how do we regulate to protect the future of Africa? For me, that's a question I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks very much. Well, let's come back to our panel. We've heard basically sort of this challenge around sort of disinformation and manipulation, question about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, question also of kicking off and supporting African companies in Africa. So who would like to come in on this? Yeah.
I'm happy to jump on the supporting African companies in Africa. I feel that there's some work that is currently being done with some African countries, including Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, where they are digitizing the investment promotion agencies. This is very important because it provides a lot of information into how to start a business. Some of these countries have already started to digitize the process of starting a business in the country, a lot of information around e-regulation, and also greater information around the national priorities when it comes to socioeconomic development. I feel that this is one way, I'm not saying all African countries are doing that, but the ones that are currently doing this is one way of supporting, current startup and emerging startups. I also feel that another solution here can be to subsidize programs. So you mentioned that you are currently in the process of building an education technology startup.
Selling services from Africa.
And this is really good because there is a particular need, for the countries for the country you are targeting. And I feel here, when it comes to creating that impact, I think it is important that if, let's say, you're targeting Cote d'Ivoire and back home gender equality is an issue, then make it your issue as well for the business to tackle that. This is one way, the government, they can support you in terms of providing subsidy programs. And this is also a call to action to African government when we see a lot of startups wanting to do the right thing and wanting to address or tackle barriers, having the right subsidy program, the right incentives to support startups. But I feel that, again, digitizing the process around investment promotion is really good. And again, ensuring that whatever you want to do in that particular country is backed up by strong data and is able to clearly envision that, okay, this is the, let's say, impact that you can have on XYZ society. So this is my input for your question.
I think maybe to add to that, Singapore is a great example of a startup nation that has been able to fight against the global pattern, because the global pattern is that the startup world is controlled by capital, and the bulk of the capital that is funding the startup world comes from the US. That's where the most of it comes. Even Europe is suffering from it. Like a lot of the big technology companies in Europe are domiciled in the US. So it's not something that is unique to Africa. But I think the level of leadership that is required, you can see the pattern in Singapore where certain incentives were created And the innovation systems for the country was also developed in such a way that partnership and relationships with allies were prioritized. And that would help you understand things around, for instance, if someone is investing in a startup in Nairobi, the biggest pain is how do they get their money out when they need to get out. That's their biggest pain. And this is what is responsible for the entire narrative and confusion in the startup world. There's nothing much more than that. If I put the money into you in the UK, how easy is it for me to get my money out? Yeah. It's not because they want everyone to be in Delaware. And you can see that there's repercussion for the world as well. We saw the Silicon Valley Bank going down and startups all over the world suffering from it. So I think leadership again is what we need, where government needs to start to understand that running a society in today's world is not just about politics. Yeah. It's also about understanding the dynamics of war runs, economies today, and how do you position yourself. That's why the Prime Minister in the UK, when the Silicon Valley Bank went down, he came out and he gave a speech. Like, there was no precedent in Africa who talked about that. That's how linked these things are. So I still think it's leadership. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done about mainstreaming the conversation. All the other questions you've asked as well, whether it's the manipulation, because we have a youthful population, most of them will get excited about cryptocurrency, but we don't have contextualized position. Most of the positions on cryptocurrency in Africa is being copied, right? But we're very weak because you're going to be talking about the sovereignty of nations in Africa. When the financial system in Africa is being managed by a kid that has moved to Bahamas or some island somewhere, who can't even keep a company together for 2 years. I work with young founders. There's limitation. You want people to be creative, but there's also responsibility to society. So Africa needs to rise up. That's why more of us needs to also do PhDs as well. Don't do PhDs because you want to be called doctors. Yeah. Right? Don't do it because you're looking for a teaching position at LSE. We have to do these things because we want to get to the bottom of the knowledge that drives society and apply. Because they're not going to listen to you. Most of the leaders in Africa will not listen to you. They will listen to the PhDs from Europe or somewhere else who don't understand the local context. For me, I think knowledge, leadership from both government, academia, but also private sector is what we desperately need on the continent.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to add. I think all has been said. I think, the ease of doing business and I think is very much related to where we started this conversation around digitalization of government, right? If as a business or as a startup, the cost of doing your business is so high, right? Because the public services are very poor, you're likely not to base your business in an African country, right? Because at the end of the day, for any business to be the business has to be profitable. The bottom line is the most important thing, and I think there's definitely work there to be done from the public sector and from the government to actually ease those processes. I know in the continent, for instance, many startups have come together through what they call startup acts. So the first one was in Tunisia. There's one that passed currently that was voted in Senegal, and the idea is really how to help government. And I think that's also important to say that the politicians and our leaders don't necessarily understand the context as well as we understand it, right? If we are in the field, if we're in the terrain. So having really actors who are living within the community, who are experts, advise government and help co-create legislation with government is really key to help them actually find the right answer. And so we've seen a bit of that through Chartered Acts, and I think there's more that can be done within the tech community. I mean, I'll touch on the question of the disinformation and the surveillance capitalism because it's a core part of my work. I mean, it's a complicated problem, right? It's very complicated, and I completely agree with you being on that space that we need to find a way to allow innovation to foster while having the right rules and policy to protect the population. But then it becomes a slippery slope in the African continent in that every time we unfortunately see a law against disinformation in the continent, it's around censorship, right? It's around dissident censorship. So how do you find the balance there to allowing freedom of speech, allowing safety, but also still allowing democracy to thrive? And opposition is a key part of any democracy. And that's what, digital technology have done, so to speak, is that it has given a voice to many people who didn't have voice before, right? And it has allowed their voice as well to to be joined up and be much more powerful. And there is really an important process of democratization and renew of African democracies that's happening through technology that's quite fascinating. So we want to make sure that, that bears its fruits in terms of being constructive while making sure that we're protecting. And here I would go back to digital literacy. It's really important that as Africans are coming online, we're also investing in critical thinking skills, that we're investing in saying, hey, everything you see on Twitter or Facebook is not true. Double check, fact check your message, because that's one tool we know that if we have that for sure, we'll be able to reap the benefits of technology while ensuring that citizens remain protected.
Thanks very much. Well, now, of course, I've been reminded, quite rightly, but we have a digital inclusion agenda of our own here at LSE, because we are joined by an online audience, hopefully across different parts of Africa and the world. So I wondered if we could invite a couple of, I don't know who's going to be.
Yeah, I'll be taking the questions.
That'd be great. A couple of questions.
We have a couple of questions from them. The first one says, I'm glad we're talking about technology in general, software and hardware. Looking at Africa has a lower cost of living and low wage rate. Do we think Africa can take the advantage, just like China, to promote hardware manufacturing? So that's the first question. We have another question from Aaron, who says, I looked into investing in digital infrastructure whilst out in the Gambia, but there seems to be a monopoly that prevents competition in terms of the main internet gateway. Does the free area or regional blocks like the ECOWAS have any directives around opening up competition? So does bodies like the ECOWAS have any directives on opening up competition? And the last question is, since the digital economy does not exist in a vacuum, which economic sectors will be drivers of a large-scale and inclusive digital revolution, especially in a context where many African countries struggle with industrialization? So these are the few questions for now.
So thanks very much. So we got basically the question of infrastructure and investment, the question of competition,
and what other sectors of the what other economic sectors will be drivers for industrialization, for the digital revolution? Yeah.
Right, Matt, sector focus. So who would like to come in on this?
I think sorry, go on.
No, go for it.
I think promoting the hardware manufacture, it is very important, because one of the barriers towards the adoption and use of mobile in sub-Saharan Africa, it's handset affordability. So it's not just about a business wanting to set up in an African country and then let's do that. We should go like a step forward. How can we manufacture handset that can be affordable for those communities? And this again requires a public-private partnership where we have businesses wanting to set up in an African country but has that enabling environment. So for the government, it looks like setting up like policy targets for ICT related things, or let's say wanting to achieve like a certain digital literacy. This will enable businesses not just to go there but then have a goal to work towards. So I think this is one of the solution that can be, it's not the only one, but this one of the solution that can be like appropriate for this context.
Yeah, and I just was about to add on what you were saying. I think the question around digital infrastructure and the monopoly of incumbent operators is a key one, and I think it's a problem that is actually common across many African countries, and a lot of the time the incumbents also are funded by the government. They're part public or fully public. It's a tough one, right? I don't know of any directive in the ECOWAS that addresses it specifically, but I know from, for instance, taking the example of Senegal, where we were able to have some competition or to foster competition in the MNO sector by making sure that there were regulation around open access infrastructure and infrastructure sharing, right? So instead of everyone building their own cable, we actually have legislation that would encourage private sector to actually share the infrastructure. So that's one way where you can have a competitive market and differentiation in price, because as you were saying, and like one of the biggest barrier to access is still price. It's very expensive to have access to data in an African country compared to here. What I pay in the UK versus like what I would pay in Senegal, and given the cost of living and the difference is quite big. So I would say regulation around open access are quite useful, but I do agree that it's still a barrier. maybe one of the other point I wanted to mention, and I think one of the question was talking at digital infrastructure and competition broadly speaking, is the fact that and the hardware point around cheap labor and the fact that Africa has a competitive advantage there from to China or India by providing cheap labor. And it's an interesting point, and it's a very appealing point, but you know, the human rights person in me have to raise alarms, right? We're talking about cobalt, which is used, right, to power most of the electric cars coming from the DRC, and it's being exploited in horrendous conditions by children, right? And and there are huge violations to human rights as well as to the environment being done. I think we want to develop, we want economic prosperity in the African continent, but I do think we have to do it in the right way, right? And I think we have to be very careful about what we wish for just for the sake of economic development, right? Because it will come back to bite us, right? And so thinking about how do we create the right environment and the right infrastructure for the growth of the industrialization of the African continent, while in respect of human rights and environmental issues is key, is a key question to keep in mind.
That's really great.
Just to add to the question on the sectors, I think as you can see, you know, financial services has been one trigger for the startup ecosystem in the last probably 10 years. It's one of the areas where we've seen a lot of billion-dollar businesses. And it's because it was, you know, it's quite central to every economy, right? So there was obvious need for innovation in that space. I think the next one that is brewing will be education. Because if you look at the number of kids who are either out of school or not learning appropriately, you're beginning to see a lot of efforts around funding for innovation in education, because we do know that the strength of Africa is the youth, right? That's our biggest resources at the minute. And for us to tap into that, we have to ensure that they have the right education, you know, for the future that we're aspiring for. So I see a lot of opportunity there. I think public health is also going to continue to probably, you know, encourage more innovation, because as the world is getting connected, COVID has reminded us of, you know, how things can become really complex. So there's more money that is going into public health as well. Feeding the world, I think, is also becoming big, doing it in really smart ways. So Africa also, as we start to warm up and get more sectors innovating, I think you're going to see more innovation in agriculture as well. For the question on hardware, this is something, you know, I've worked on for years. I've traveled to China to look at, you know, what's being done. I think the biggest problem is it's not just about cheap labor. We always ignore the know-how that comes with China and the ability to be competitive in that space. I think we need to start thinking, how do we strengthen our hardware ecosystem, innovation ecosystem? We don't have enough of that. We've invested in a couple of hardware companies, and for a long time, they would typically have to go to China to get all their kit. But you're beginning to see changes. Trust me, I've not been paid by the governor to keep saying that. So there's a company in Nairobi now called Gearbox, which used to be part of IOB before we acquired IOB, but this spun out. And they were able to get into partner with a company in Europe, I think UK company called Europlacer. And now they manufacture, Governor, if you've not been there, I think you should visit them. They manufacture like boards for electronics. So most electronics that you see, they have a board, a chip on it, which is the standard kit that you need to be able to produce them. So they now manufacture that, you know, in Nairobi. There's a Kenyan man who spent all his life in the US that is now back in Nairobi, is the engineer behind it. So we're beginning to see that kind of thing pop up. And that's why I was saying the knowledge out there, out here, is also part of what's going to change Africa. So if we're going to see hardware start to change, there's still a lot that we need to build. And I think most people who may be engineers in that space, there's massive opportunities for you to also participate in building that ecosystem.
Wonderful, thank you. We've now got 6 minutes left for questions, not speeches disguised as questions. So I'm going to come back into the room if that's all right. I'm a diplomat, I've seen lots of those. So I wonder if we can very quickly take 3 final questions, very brief if I may, and I'm going to come back to the panel for brief responses. So let me come up here first to the lady there in the middle. Yeah. Have we got a... Yes, perfect.
Thank you. My name is Aisha Agbolaje. I'm a final year business student from Nigeria. My question is about e-commerce in Africa. I know social media is one of the main marketplaces for people to do business, especially in Nigeria. What do you see happening in that sector in terms of maybe platforms like Amazon? I know Amazon is making strides into coming into Nigeria. We have our own homegrown, maybe not completely homegrown, like Konga, Jumia. What do you see happening in that space?
Thank you. Okay, and then coming over here, I'll come to the gentleman there. Yeah.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Simon Morasia. I'm a Kenyan. I run a blog called Kenya to You Hub. And it's really interesting to be in this forum today because the issue on digital revolution is one that in many terms, many of the speakers have emphasized on the Nairobi, and Kenya, which I like. I'm wearing the t-shirt, I'm proud. And I'm here to support my governor on the day. But I'm worried. Since I came to this country, 1995, to date, many of these forums I've attended, we haven't found a solution in digital for environment and creation of food. We're still talking about feeding people and the poor. How do we, as a continent, harness digital patterns? Today, in the Greenwich Mean Time, the time changed, the zones changed. What is the future for digital to enable us harness it better? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm just going to go to this gentleman here, and with apologies to those of you who are missing, but there will be a chance afterwards, I think, to ask questions.
Hello, good morning. My name is William Awomoyi. I'm the UK's Young Ambassador to the Commonwealth and an advisor for the AFCTA Youth Advisory Council. My question is to do with human capital development and the diaspora. I think there's a lot of scaremongering when it comes to the brain drain. And I think it's only really a brain drain when the talent that's lost doesn't give anything back. So my question here is, what can the diaspora do to essentially give back to Africa? What do you see, and what do you think that the diaspora can do in that regard?
Excellent, thanks very much. So we've got diaspora and giving back. We've got a question about environment and agriculture. And we've got a question about sort of Amazon, and not just presuming Nigeria, but thinking about Amazon in Africa. Who would like to?
I can start with e-commerce. I think e-commerce is massive for a country like Nigeria. 200 million plus people, with a lot of gap in the value chain when it comes to products and services. And you've seen already, like Jumia's largest market on the continent was Nigeria. Konga was big. But the challenge again was these businesses are linked to ecosystem, right? You can't run an e-commerce business alone, if your logistics system is not super tight, financial services and every other thing that you need to see. And if the society is also still largely cash-based, I think that's the biggest challenge for a country like Nigeria. But unfortunately, when the current wave of startup ecosystem started, e-commerce was a major part of it. So they got the funding, got everything, but the success wasn't coming. So you can see that that's been de-emphasized a little. Most people are not investing in e-commerce at the minute. But when you look at what people are doing with things like Instagram, like how much businesses are selling on Instagram, it's incredible. Like the direct-to-consumer opportunities that exist there. But there's still opportunity to plug that gap, right? There's opportunity to ensure that we build all the different infrastructure. My biggest fear for e-commerce in Nigeria is actually Amazon. I think the moment they come in, they're going to own that space, because one of the big issues that we have as well is inventory. Do you have access to the best products from all over the world? Currently, that's a bit of a problem. And if you can plug the Amazon ecosystem into a country like Nigeria, which means you can get any of their products, I think it's a market that is waiting for them. It will be good for the consumers, and it will be good for the local market as well, because there's so many other businesses you can build on top of Amazon. On human capital development and the role of diaspora, I think about 5 years ago, we did a program with Facebook, actually, in London. It's something that is big for me. I've been saying to my family, that may be where I retire, Because when you look at the journey, I'm not going to waste too much time on this, but when you look at the journey of the typical uh, African, especially Nigerian immigrants to this country, it's changing because the age is changing. But when I came to study at Warwick, most of my mates were above 30. And once they come in, they have to give about 5 years thereabouts to become British citizen, which everyone will fight for because it's incredible value, right?
Yeah.
And most people, by the time they're done doing that fight, they're getting close to 40. And by the time these folks are 40, they're not the kind of people that is thinking of innovation. I've got tons of friends that we came into this country. I was one of the stupid ones who decided, after Warwick, to leave here. I was living here and I was doing my business in Nigeria. So I had to come back because you have to be here for a certain number of days for you to be able to. And I was paying my tax here as well to be able to get it. But a lot of people can't do that. So you find so many smart folks in diaspora who are stuck in jobs because the immigration systems will not give you the chance to actually explore the pattern and the path that you want to explore. So I still think there's an opportunity for us to bind together, especially for the second generation folks who don't have to deal with that pain, and start to open up the continent more to these people, give them the opportunities to believe that they can actually be creators. And one thing that most people in diaspora also don't know is that the biggest founders of startups in Africa are also from abroad. Right? But most of them are Ivy League folks, which is something that is not popularized in the UK. But in the US is well known. Most of the founders who raise a lot of money are folks that have lived abroad, so it's easy for them to access the network. So I think that's a challenge for Africans in diaspora to know that the opportunity is there for them. I'll leave the rest of the questions.
Thanks, Bosun. Anna-Noemie.
Sure. I wanted to jump in on the e-commerce part, and I echo what Dr. Bosun mentioned around the challenges with e-commerce, but also, the untapped opportunities that this sector offers. So, like e-commerce on its own, that has that opportunity to offer greater expansion for new market opportunities, for access to information, which are very key for women and men back in sub-Saharan Africa, especially the ones that are in the MSMEs. So I think this is one way to tap into the e-commerce opportunity. Another way is through e-commerce. I see that they are the World Bank, in partnership with some other organization, they are in the business of providing heuristic training, which is for women that are in rural areas. Through their phone, they can have like trainings around how to conduct their business online, via voice notes at their time. And I think this is really good because this is again taps into, ensuring that you are navigating with success the e-commerce space. So I think, the e-commerce is something, it's a sector that we shouldn't overlook or understate because it has that opportunity to offer that greater socioeconomic drive. In terms of there was a question around giving back. I will say one thing, this conversation we had today is good, and I will say that digital inclusion is one that can keep us connected to the world in so many layers, across many environments. The second thing that I also want to say is that although we know that African governments have the responsibility and the duty of care towards citizens, but we shouldn't just, let's say, wait for them to do things. We should be empowered in our own to, start businesses. I love the co-creation hub because, this is again a way, to get training, the skills, like to be in that environment that will make you thrive. So each and everyone here should feel empowered, to join, to connect with the right people during those organizations and think about how we can also bring change in Africa, not just count on the government or, policymakers. They have their role to play, but we also have our role to play. And regardless of where you are in the world, whether you are like an African in Europe or American, or you're an African like in Africa, you have that role to play for your continent.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, I'll try to be quick because I think most of it have been said. There was one question around digital environment and improving food system. Look, completely agree. I think there's a great role for tech on that. I know there's a lot of investment from DFI specifically on that area, and a couple of startups across the continent who are looking at how they can improve, allow farmers, for instance, to have access to AI to be able to have predictive models about their crops. So it's an interesting space, very nascent, but I think there's an investment coming there, and I think it's one definitely that is also key to unlock for the continent. And then I'll jump on the last question around the diaspora. I completely agree with you that the journey, and you were saying that as well, it's just not one way. You go and then you never come back, right? And especially that's with the joy of technology. I remember I left home when I was very young, and it was just so expensive to call my parents. I don't know if anyone have lived through the calling card generation where like you had to pay a lot of money as a poor student to get a calling card and you get 8 minutes and sometimes it doesn't even work. WhatsApp has solved that problem, right? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you're on the internet and you feel still connected because of the internet. You know what's going on in your home country. And I think that's really important to make sure that those who left and the diaspora is still have ties, right? And it's ongoing. And second was what Bosun was saying around network is really key, right? If you know that the market of startups is really underpinned by capital. Capital is underpinned by network. Do you know high worth people, right? Like those people who will allow you to raise funds and being able to have again the diaspora evolve in the context when they have access to those networks mean that they can bring funds back to the continent. And there I would say the role of government and the political leaders is create the infrastructure for that, right? I've been abroad for about 20 years now or 15 years and I've never met one African who's never said I want to give back, like I want to go back. But generally the problem is that they don't know how, like it just feels so disconnected, disorganized, or they try coming back, they have big ideas, they have money, they get scammed, and then they're like, I'm going back, I'm never coming back, right? So how do we create the infrastructure, right, for those people who want to come back to give back, to really have vessels where they can invest or bring their brains and their knowledge and co-build as well with the people on the ground. And then the last note is, and I will say it as an African in the diaspora, is that sometimes as African in the diaspora, we live and we go to this big school, this big institution, and we think that we know better. Yeah. We don't. We really don't, right? It's important to have humility when we come back to the continent. There are things we know, there are things we don't know, just because we don't live every day the struggles of some of our peers who've stayed in the country. And I think being in a diaspora and engaging with a mindset of humility is really key for success as well.
Wonderful. Well, look, this has been a really amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Can we just perhaps put a big hand together for Aida, for both and Anna-Noemie.
Thank you so much for that really rich conversation. May I please ask that you stand a bit while I take a quick photo of you? And while they're taking that